Hi, my name is Michael Towers, and I'm back with the last video in this series about a non-pathologizing approach to counseling. Today, I'm inviting all of us to think about anger and shame a bit differently. Let me start by providing a history of anger. We've had this difficult relationship with emotions from as far back as we can trace human history, it seems. But in particular, when we look at the role of emotions in mental health in the late 20th century and going into the 60s, we saw this interesting coincidence happen. In North America, predominantly in the States, there is massive amounts of civil unrest and a whole bunch of different events were taking place. Then, at the beginning of the 1970s, what we saw was the emergence of the very first anger management program. And that began a start of a new direction for psychotherapists in treating emotions. We were now given the blueprint in order to communicate to our clients how to manage our emotions, how to control our emotions, minimize them, take control of them. When we study brain science, and in particular how the memory functions work, and this is in recent years of brain science, what we see is this very interesting deconstruction and reconstruction of memory. And what we learn and take away from that is that the cognitive aspects of our brain and the emotive and sensory aspects of our brain are equal. They operate the same. They both need each other. And it invites us into this different relationship with emotions. And this is where I'm wanting to introduce working with emotions. And today I'm talking about shame and anger from a non-pathologizing perspective. And so this idea of anger from a non-pathologizing perspective is that emotions just are. They're neither good or bad. We do not moralize them. And instead, I've taken this stance in my work to understand anger as being our friend. And I'll even take it one step further. In my research around anger from a non-pathologizing perspective, what I have found is that when we take a look at the client's own experience and relationship to anger, and we look at what I've called their origin stories, when anger has first showed up in their life, and tracing those stories throughout their life, what we find is that anger is showing up to do the exact same thing over and over again throughout their life. In other words, we can determine what the role of anger is to a specific individual. And this is really important to understand our relationship to anger from a non-pathologizing perspective. And in particular with this cycle that I'm going to introduce you to this idea of anger and shame. To help us understand the framework, I practice from a systems perspective. So systems would be a relationship you have with your partner or your family of origin, your friends, your co-workers, other social groups. Those are microsystems. We could also identify whatever our gender is, our sexual orientation, our race, our culture, our faith. These would be more macro systems. So each one of these systems that we belong to have a structure. We're invited to find acceptance and belonging in each of these systems. And in a sense, we could think about it as a form of membership. And each one of these systems has what I've referred to as explicit rules and implicit rules. In other words, those spoken, universally understood rules and those unspoken rules that we just understand we need to follow. An example of this might be a heterosexual couple in a relationship, and they've decided to be exclusive, and it's just understood, the implicit rule is understood that they're going to have a monogamous relationship. So we have these systems and we have these rules connected to these systems. And we understand a little bit more about anger. So let me bring shame into it now. Brene Brown, as some of you may know, did some wonderful work around helping us understand shame and vulnerability in her early research. And she's written a couple books about that. And so I've built this non-pathologizing research on some of those ideas, but I've taken it in a bit of a different direction. My introduction to shame actually goes back to the 1990s when I was working with Indigenous communities in the interior of BC. I was developing a restorative justice program, and out of that work, I formed a nonprofit, and that work won an Attorney General Award. And then I had the opportunity to travel around BC and present this program to many communities. But the idea of the restorative justice program came from working with tribal councils and understanding the Indigenous ways of restoration. And so the basic example of this is that I'd be invited into a community, and within the community, there'd be someone who has brought some sort of harm to their community. And their practice would that they would gather together, and the offender would listen to how their actions impacted everyone in the community. And then the offender would have a chance to respond to what they have heard. But then this very interesting thing happened afterwards, is that the community then surrounded that offender and welcomed them back into community. Here we saw the first ideas of shame in a healing way, a healthy way. And we certainly see this mimicked in early childhood development, where we have parents of very small children, and as they are instructing their children on the rules of that system, shame shows up as a way of bringing about a behavioral compliance to those rules. And done in a supportive and healthy way, they surround the child with love and connection and safety, and the child can conform to those rules, and they can feel safe and secure in that system. So now, if we take a look at shame, and from a pathologizing perspective, what we have here is this idea that has been perpetuated in our profession, that shame is an emotion that originates within us. And consequently, all of the research around understanding shame and the various symptoms of shame invite us to a place where the most common intervention is self-esteem, self-compassion. And so the idea that we're conveying to our clients, which I feel is problematic, is that, oh, you're experiencing shame. If only you could learn to love yourself more, then you won't be experiencing shame. From a non-pathologizing perspective, here's where things get very different. I'm going to invite you to think about shame as originating from the various systems that we are connected to. And what happens is that when we don't follow a rule in one of those systems, that system invites us to feel shame as a way of compelling us into a behavioral compliance with those rules. And so now we have this very interesting correlation between shame and anger and the systems that we are connected to. And again, think about the most immediate systems in your life: your partner, your family of origin, work, friends, social groups, those types of things. And I'm going to invite you, as you think about how shame has showed up in your life, answer this question. What rule are you breaking? And when you answer that question, then assign the system to it. Where does that rule come from? What system is it connected to? Reframing our experience of shame from this perspective, this non-pathologizing perspective, immediately disentangles us from it, immediately externalizes us from this idea of shame. But it does something more. It invites us into a place of differentiation. It brings in autonomy for us. You see, what happens as we are experiencing shame and we pause is the reframing of the question goes like this. What rules are you choosing not to follow? And in reframing the question that way, I'm inviting autonomy for the client to reflect on some of these very imposing rules that the various systems, both micro and macro, have had on their life. And in naming the rule and naming the system that rule comes from. Now the client has an opportunity to decide whether or not they want to follow that rule. Let me illustrate this for you. We have a heterosexual couple cohabitating. The male comes from very strong patriarchal views around the domestication of the female, meaning there's an expectation that she is going to cook and clean and care for him. She doesn't want to cook and clean and care for him in those ways. And so she stops doing those activities. That system, their relationship, invites her to feel shame for not following those rules. So as she's experiencing that shame, this isn't about learning how to assert oneself. This isn't about learning how to love oneself more. This is about identifying the rules, which in this case would be, hey, you're a female and you should be doing these domestic duties. And the system that comes from is the patriarchal system and originating from this relationship. The female then decides that she doesn't want to follow those rules. And here is where we see anger showing up. Now, anger, as we've established earlier in this conversation, has a particular role to play. Anger is her friend. And the role of anger showing up to have her needs met, to have her validated, to have her seen, whatever the case may be, has another function, which is to convince the system to have her reconnect back to the system. You see, as shame originates from the system, it also comes with the threat of disconnection from that system. And this is what causes so much disruption for a person experiencing shame, is that they are suddenly feeling very alone and isolated. That's the threat of disconnection that we experience from the various systems around us. And so in this example I've given you, she's feeling that threat of disconnection. If she doesn't comply with these rules, then there's a threat that this relationship might be over. But anger shows up going, hey, what about my needs? And perhaps anger is successful in having the system change the rules to accommodate her. That's fantastic. But maybe that's only short-lived and the problem comes back. The rules come back and the shame comes back from the system again. See, what happens now is that with this cycle of not following the rules, shame showing up, threat of disconnection, anger showing up, what might happen is that we end up leaving that system. So there's going to be some grief and loss that comes from it. But what we've gained is a sense of autonomy, a sense of strength and power in our voice, a sense of the differentiated self. We've kept ourselves safe throughout this entire process, and we've learned some things about ourselves. We've learned what rules we are not going to be following. Now, I've just used a simple example, this heterosexual couple. This gets more complex when you take into fact the macro systems that surround us, that show up with the expectations within our faith community, within our culture community, race community, gender community, sexual orientation, and all of the imposing rules that we either willingly or unwillingly follow. And so the summary that I'd like you to take away from these 4 videos around non-pathologizing is that there's a different way to show up in mental health. There's a different expectation you can have of your therapist. And what I mean by that is that you can show up with an expectation that as we move away from the medical model, we move away from pathology and treating the symptoms. We move into this empowering place of a non-pathologizing approach, meaning you will never be the problem. And in that process, we find different ways, translated ways of working with your mental health and those presenting problems that will not perpetuate a pathology, that will, in fact, increase your sense of autonomy and provide opportunities for you to discover who you are and how you want to be known. I invite all of you out there to rewatch these videos as much as you need to understand it, and you can reach out to me to continue the conversation. You can find me at www.michaeltowers.ca. Thank you.